and emerging. Hello and welcome to another National Centre Student Equity in Higher Education webinar, which is focusing on the broad theme of COVID-19 and supporting our students in this time. These webinars are being kindly facilitated by ADSET, as Darlene mentioned, and this week we're looking at students' well-being during COVID-19. My name is Sarah and I'm the Director of the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Ed, which is housed at Curtin University and funded by the Commonwealth Government. We have a dedicated mission to improving the higher education outcomes, access, participation, retention, success and completion rates for marginalised and disadvantaged people. However, in a matter of weeks, now months really, we found ourselves in a new working and learning context, and we are navigating unplanned terrain at the moment. So this webinar is really looking at some of the emotional impacts on our student populations, specifically the emotional and well-being needs of our students, drawing on current interview data with students from a range of areas. I'm delighted to introduce Associate Professor Lydia Woodyatt from Flinders University. Lydia, I had the pleasure of hearing Lydia's presentation face-to-face about 18 months ago, and it looks really clearly at the intersection of social, clinical and organisational psychology and how we might use that intersection to increase engagement and motivation, positive relationships and help people work through difficult emotions. Lydia has won awards for her teaching and also leads Flinders University's retention success strategy. So this webinar really adopts a just-in-time approach to providing suggestions about what you can do in just 5 minutes, which is what I like about it, to support well-being based on the psychological needs of students. We will explore how small changes in teaching practice can sometimes make big impacts on student learning, well-being and motivation. So I'll pass over to Lydia now, and I hope you all enjoy the presentation.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So it's nice to be with you all. Of course, I wish we could be actually together in the physical space. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling the lack of some of our conferences and communities of practice and meetups where we get together and encourage each other. So I thought I'd start by just saying you're doing a good job. Wherever you are, whatever it is that you're doing. Normally when we get together, I think that some of the key features of that experience is sharing what we're dealing with, the stuff that's difficult and hard and frustrating, and just saying you're doing a good job. You're actually making progress on this issue, and whatever it is, if you've shown up through this season, if you've been supporting your students, if you've been thinking about what's essential and what's non-essential, trying to make university as navigable as you can, then you're doing a great job. And sometimes we can feel like when we're up against it in the details, we kind of get lost and we feel like we're battling it alone, but you're not alone. We're actually in this together, and I'm really proud to be part of a sector that values equity, that values diversity, that sees the importance of higher education and what a difference it can make to the lives of the Australian community. So wherever you're coming to us from, just welcome. I also want to add my acknowledgement to country. I'm very, very pleased and proud and privileged to live and work on Kaurna land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, because we are just so committed to reconciliation, to restoration and to just acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples of Australia and how they contribute to our society. All right, so what I want to do today is I want to talk about really some key principles that can underpin how we think about supporting wellbeing in our practice. And I will be giving probably about half of the talk to talking through those principles, because I think if you get the principles, then actually you can kind of apply that in lots of different ways to lots of different practice. And in fact, my specific examples are going to be drawn on from teaching practice, because really that's kind of my background. I give similar talks to all sorts of industries to talk about ways of improving their practice to support wellbeing in all sorts of different work environments. So it doesn't just have to apply to teaching. If you kind of get the principles, you can apply it to supporting wellbeing across a range of domains. So I mentioned that my background is teaching. Let me step back a little bit further. I am a first in family student to go to university. I grew up in Western Sydney primarily. I spent my early years up until about the age of 8 in Papua New Guinea, and then came back and lived in far Western Sydney. So if you're from out towards past Blacktown, keep going. Went to school in a place called Riverston. Like I mentioned, I was first in my family to go to university. I moved to study, and my background was in pastoral care, and the first kind of 7 or 8 years of my career was really spent supporting all sorts of marginalised groups, particularly refugees from African backgrounds, but also low income earners, people on with various kind of complex social needs. It was during that time that I decided to go back to university again. And then I came back in my late 20s and I started studying psychology. During that time, I came into higher education. I guess I started my PhD around 2009, 2010, forget when, 2009. And during that time, I was finishing up right when the widening participation agenda came in. So I was lucky enough to get given a position as a director of first year studies. That's really been my specialty ever since, is really focusing on first year strategies within curriculum and how we can support transition in. I later added in transition out and started teaching final year students as well. But I guess that's kind of my background, is being a first in family student myself, seeing some of the needs that I echoed with from my own experience, but then also having now about a decade of teaching first year students and seeing transition needs, and really being influenced, I guess, by Sally Kiff's work on, and that kind of fundamental idea that transition needs need to be managed in curriculum. I saw it very early on in my teaching practice that anything that I did outside of core curriculum, it became opt-in, and that meant that my most at-need students were not able to participate. So that thinking's been really fundamental, I guess, to all of my teaching practice as a lecturer in psychology, and now as someone who works around retention strategies and policy and implementation. It was probably about 2 or 3 years ago that we really, maybe longer, where we really started to focus then not just on transition needs, but actually curriculum as a source of support for wellbeing needs. So when it comes to psychological wellbeing, how can we actually embed practice within curriculum to support students? Again, because if we don't have it in the curriculum, then the people who need it the most often are unable to access it. We know that the resources around extracurricular student support, that one-on-one counselling, they're always finite, they're always limited. And particularly the best way we can often support students most at need is by enabling processes within curriculum that support kind of our first level of stepped care for wellbeing needs. So that's kind of the background to the whole way I've approached thinking about wellbeing and how we can implement it in our teaching. The other thing that's really had a huge influence on me was the work of James Lang. He has a book, actually, I've put a link into an article, but he also has a book on small changes to teaching. This is basically the idea of, if something's worth doing, we don't necessarily have to reinvent our entire curriculum to achieve it, but we can look at the small everyday things we do, the things that take us 5 minutes in class, and we can rework something that we're going to be doing anyway, but to do it to achieve a different kind of outcome for our students. So I've taken a lot of his thinking and been applying that to the wellbeing practices that I was aware of, and starting to think about how they then can integrate into curriculum time. So basically behind this is the idea of going, okay, what are the normal things I do in my interactions with students or in running my course? And I mean the really mundane stuff, like how do I note attendance or participation? How do I give welcome messages? How do I go through the learning outcomes of the course? How do I give feedback on assignments? The everyday practices that we do, and thinking about them through the lens of wellbeing and going, how could I do this slightly differently in order to achieve a wellbeing outcome? I call this talk 5 meaningful minutes because basically it's underpinned by this idea of taking something that only takes 5 minutes of your time or 5 minutes of your students' time and getting them to do it so that you can address those needs. I call it meaningful minutes because there's this core thread of what makes things meaningful for people is the same thing that underpins well-being, motivation, and actually their emotional experience. And that's really, from my perspective, grounded in psychological needs theory. So I guess by the end of this session, what I'd like you to be able to do is have a broad understanding of what those psychological needs are, to be able to think through your own everyday practice and be able to identify 1 or 2 things you do and how you might be able to tweak them to do something that only takes 5 minutes but might better support your students within the curriculum. So when we talk about models of psychological wellbeing, I'm sure many of you, if you've expressed interest in this topic, are interested in psychological wellbeing. You might have come across different models of psychological wellbeing, and there are many out there. Some of the really common ones, and the one that I probably draw on the most is self-determination theory, or sometimes this is referred to as basic psychological needs theory. You might be familiar with the work of Martin Seligman, the PERMA model or the PERMA Plus model. There's a whole range of different psychological need theories, but they kind of have some core things to them. So what I'm going to talk you through is my putting together of what I think are those core psychological needs. And so it's really drawing from all of the theories that I have listed on the slide there. You'll see there are differences in terms of numbers of how many needs get addressed, and that's kind of still up for debate across the field. So you've got Abelli, who identified these 2 needs of agency and communion as primary. You've got Carol Riff, who has 6 psychological needs. But no matter how many numbers there are, if you look along them, there are some really key themes, I think, that cut across all those different models. The other thing I should mention is that I'm a social psychologist by trade. So my research is very much influenced by social identity theory. So this is the idea that my identity is not just made up of my own sense of myself, but actually the groups that I identify with, and that those groups that I identify with become part of my identity. And then depending on the context I find myself, those groups can be more or less salient or obvious to me, and then they guide and direct my motivation, my behaviour in those contexts. I'm also very influenced by the work of Mark Leary and how he thinks about the need for belonging. So I'll talk a little bit about that in detail. But I do think that some of the work, the social identity theory work, and also the work by Mark Leary, if you read through that, it really starts to expand our idea of what the need for belonging is. And I'll talk through that a bit more as we go on. So let me talk us through these psychological needs. So like I said, there's lots of different numbers you could choose, but I'm choosing 4. Why? It makes sense to me that you will see that these are overlapping, that they definitely influence each other. So you can kind of understand how they get shifted around. I'm going to start by talking about the need for belonging, this psychological need for belonging. Mark Leary would go as far as to argue that this is the primary need for humans, that the need for belonging is very much wired into how our whole threat, safety, survival system works. Sometimes I can see this need for belonging when we talk about it in terms of well-being. It really gets reduced down to something quite simplistic. So it can get reduced down to the need for a friend. In higher education, I think we sometimes reduce it down to, I've done it myself. We think students coming into university, we have the need for belonging. We'll invite them to some sort of social situation and we'll give them a sausage on bread, get them to stand awkwardly next to each other. Maybe we'll put them a name tag on. Need for belonging, tick. But of course, that doesn't necessarily satisfy people's need for belonging. And we know that because we've all been in those awkward situations ourselves. The need for belonging is more than the need to just have a friend or have someone to speak to. The need for belonging is really based in, Mark Leary would argue, really based in this evaluation of, am I a good and appropriate group member or relationship partner? So this kind of global judgment of myself. He argues that self-esteem is essentially like a gauge. It measures whether or not we feel like we are a good and appropriate group member or relationship partner. Of course, that's defined by the groups that we happen to identify with. And that can change over time and change depending on circumstances. So this need for belonging is as much about our social identification, those groups that we identify with, and how we evaluate our status and our position within them, our sense of being equal, our sense of being able to be part of groups that are really relevant to who we are, that we identify with, and also these kind of psychological evaluations that we make of ourselves in terms of how we fit into those groups. Now, this need is important for lots of reasons. One, we've got to recognise that this need is really wide into how humans' threat systems respond. So we have stress responses in the face of social threats, similar to how we do in the face of physical threats. This explains why every time my Zoom thing at the moment is popping up and it reminds me that there's hundreds of people logged on, my butterflies kick off a little bit in my stomach. This kind of explains why the number one fear that people speak about amongst humans is public speaking. I mean, I worked it out the other day, and I think I've done about 8,000 hours of public speaking in front of I do a lot of big classroom teaching. So in that environment, I've never had anything really dangerous or risky happen. Why is it that humans see public speaking as the number one fear? Why are we so afraid of that? Why is it such an anxiety-provoking event? Well, because it involves social evaluation, right? And the more people we're being socially evaluated by, or the more we care about them and identify with them or want to be part of them, the higher that evaluative threat is, and the higher the stress response we get in the face of that. So when we talk about this need for belonging, it's not just the need to have a friend, it's much more complex than that. It's the need to identify with groups, be part of groups, and evaluate ourselves as a good and valuable group member or potential relationship partner. This has impact when students come into university. So when students come into university, they enter into really a transition phase, not just the first year, but the entire experience of university, because they're often going from a previous identity to something out there that they don't yet know what it's going to be, right? I often describe it as monkey barring. They've kind of got something they're going to be, and they're heading towards something they're going to be, but they're kind of reaching. They don't quite know what that is. There's this identity that's going to be emerging. And so we know that actually in terms of transition, the research that we're doing in our lab at the moment on transition and identity and wellbeing has really shown us that that past identity is really key. Having that strong previous identity you can hang on to is really important in these early stages of transition, because it enables people to start to then grab onto that next bar and establish that new sense of identity. And that's really consistent with Sarah's work as well, and on the importance of those previous identities that we bring into the environment when we come to university. So during transition, this identity transformation process, and during university, this transition process is occurring, right? People are forming new identities. So things like, what does it mean to be a good and appropriate group member or relationship partner? That has to do with what we know about the environment, what we know about the identity we're trying to get to, what the standards are, what the norms are, do we fit within that? And that can be around our student identity, or it could be around an emerging professional identity. And in fact, I think the more meaningful one often is the emerging professional identity. So do I have what it takes? Am I going to be good at that? I remember when I started my first job, I thought that basically wearing a suit was basically my symbol of what it meant to, belong, and professionally, that was what I saw a professional as. And as a 22-year-old female going into an area that was very much dominated by either women who were much older than me, so this is going into pastoral care, or men, as a 22-year-old female leader, I suited up, but I still felt like I looked around and there was no prototype of what it meant to be me. So my sense of belonging was really shaky because I couldn't look and see any version that kind of matched with who I was. And that prototype, that idea of what a professional was, the norms, were really fixed and narrow. So when students come into university, they can similarly have some really fixed, narrow or wrong ideas of what those identities are. And so when they kind of do the match of, do I belong? Am I going to fit in? That can really be thrown. Now, when we think about that in light of COVID and the fact that people are not face-to-face, that of course can really elevate some of those risks. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. So that's the need for belonging. I always spend a bit long on that because I think it is so very, very central. And in some ways, I think these other needs are kinds of spin-offs of that same core evaluation of, am I a good group member or relationship partner? The second psychological need that I'll just mention briefly is the need for purpose or meaning. So to feel like there's some reason behind our energy expenditure every day, that we get up for some sort of purpose. It doesn't have to even be a grand purpose, but just that sense of making a difference, that our work is valued, that our effort, especially when we're putting in a lot of effort, is not just meaningless. And often in university, especially if you're teaching in large courses, you know, students can feel like I'm just doing a box tick thing, that there is no, other than kind of getting that degree way off when, my work doesn't matter to anyone. So they can feel purposeless about the work, they can feel purposeless about the particular activities we're asking them to do. So that psychological need to have some sense of purpose, to make a difference somewhere or in someone's life, is really fundamental to psychological well-being and motivation. Third need for agency or autonomy. I always say that I like the term agency. The reason I like the term agency is because it always reminds me of secret agents, like think James Bond, think, I'm drawing a blank, other secret agents. A secret agent in the story, when you think about, you know, a Mission Impossible character or a James Bond character, why are they so agentic? Well, it's not that they control everything that's happening. It's actually that they have what it takes to respond to whatever is going on around them. And even when things get crazy, they've got that sense of agency that they can continue to respond and adapt in that circumstance. So agency has to do with being the actor in our own story, to feeling like we have a sense of choice, some sense of the right level of predictability. So not so much predictability that it's boring, but enough predictability that it's matched to our sense of self-efficacy, that we feel we can be effective adapting to that level of uncertainty or difficulty. And of course, having that sense of growing sense of accurate self-efficacy, that we actually see the challenge before us and we can make a realistic judgment on whether or not we're going to be able to do what's required of us. The other reason I tend to lean away from using the term autonomy is sometimes autonomy is interpreted as being on your own. And of course, that's the opposite of the message we're often wanting to send people. You're not on your own. You are in control of your own circumstance and can take agentic action in your own story. But that doesn't mean you're on your own or you're an island unto yourself. You're part of a community. The final psychological need that I like to focus on is growth. Sometimes this gets called mastery in the literature, but last year I was working with the state cricketers in South Australia, and they really changed how I use this language, because when I started to talk to these professional cricketers, they had, on one hand, they had mastery. They're great at the thing they've chosen to do. I mean, these are people that are paid to play sport. They're living the dream. But yet they could be low on this psychological need. Why? Because mastery, this need for mastery, isn't actually about mastering something. It's not about having arrived. It's about that feeling of growth, of getting better at something, of making a plan and starting to move towards it, developing that sense of new competence, having a degree of challenge, being able to immerse yourself in something that's at that optimal level of challenge so that you kind of can bring your skills to it and get into that state that's called flow. being lost in the moment, being lost in the work. So it can, anything that's kind of not challenging enough can actually be just as problematic as something that's too challenging. So this need for growth, again, human needs, it kind of underpins our sense of motivation and our sense of well-being. What's interesting, one of the examples I like to use about this is I've got a colleague who's at the top of his field, doing really well, winning grants, publishing papers, all those things. And for a long time, he would spend a lot of time on weekends writing more papers. But no, in the last few years, he's recently taken up a new hobby of playing the trombone. Now, if the only thing that rewarded people was more money, more prestige, why would you take up a challenging new instrument like the trombone in your spare time? It doesn't seem to meet any objective, hard goals. Why? Because growth, right? Because new challenges feel good. It's part of the reason why sometimes, I don't know about you, but you know, playing silly games on your phone, or when I talk to the cricketers, a lot of them playing golf was actually the thing that gave them a sense of mastery, something they were getting better at. So improving their golf game. So having something that is giving us that sense of dynamic growth is really important to our psychological well-being. So belonging, but not just having a friend, that am I a good group member? Am I a good relationship partner? Considering all the different groups that I identify with. Sense of purpose or meaning, sense of agency or autonomy, and a sense of growth or mastery. These are our key psychological needs. When these things are threatened, that leads to a whole range of aversive stress responses and emotional responses. And when they're satisfied, it can lead to our sense of satisfaction, motivation, engagement. Basically, if we want to make something meaningful for a student, we want to try and tap into these four things. So that's the background. Now we want to think about, okay, so in light of this year, what of these might specifically be having that heightened risk associated with it? And we can kind of work through each one. And I suppose ideally, if we were doing this in a long workshop form, I'd actually have you sit down and work through each of these for your students or for the subgroup of people you're working with, and go through what you think the unique challenges are in their context. This year has brought lots of challenges for our students. I had a student that was on the phone to me when we first went into lockdown because they'd already been through loss because of the bushfires. And then they found themselves in COVID, and then they're a third-year student, but they're like, Lydia, I don't think I'm doing so well. And I was like, I'm not surprised. These are really challenging experiences. But we can start to help people if we can start to build in things that will then support them through those experiences. So what happens as a result of COVID? Well, we can have a loss of the sense of agency, so feeling out of control. I think we've all had those feelings during this time, you know, just the general sense of out of control because this is big stuff going on in the world, and you know, our physical well-being is at risk. Our kids, we can feel like our kids are at risk, or our loved ones are at risk, and there's situations we might have family that's spread around the country or around the globe that can contribute to that sense of insecurity. Just loss of control of having to manage a new environment or new technologies, moving online if you weren't already online, having to manage with your whole family perhaps at home, and the relationship conflict that can be in that situation, and the challenges of, you know, managing small children, which I think has probably been one of the most difficult things I've seen. And that how that can then upset your sense of self-efficacy. So do I have what it takes in this situation? I've seen students talk about this need, their sense of purpose. So particularly third-year students, I've seen them worrying about jobs that are going to be available. They're entering into the workforce. What is that going to look like? They don't know. It's already it's more uncertain. Am I going to be able to achieve my goals? I've had students who have had to, because of loss of income or changes to their family situation, had to step back from study. And that's a challenge as well, because they feel like I'm stuck, I'm not able to progress, especially I think for I was going to say mothers, but mothers or fathers with young children, it can really feel like a barrier all of a sudden. You've been working really hard. Maybe you've been part-time and your degree's taking forever. And now you're just feeling like you're having to take another step back, and it just really hits that sense of, am I ever going to get there? Your sense of growth can be frustrated. So I don't know about anyone else, but teaching online this semester and having to adapt what is normally face-to-face third year topics taught in workshop style to online skills topics, you know, it can feel like you're starting from ground zero again. You can have that sense of, okay, well, I'm not progressing here. I'm not actually getting better at this. And then finally, I guess that sense of belonging. Obviously, we have the physical distancing that occurs and how that can impact on people and how they process that. But I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about with my students is it means that the things that we normally rely on to accidentally support students' sense of belonging, so the conversations they have, you know, in the classroom, the conversations they have before and after class, conversations with each other, those aren't happening. Now, that of course should just make us pause, because that just means we were taking it for granted that they were happening in the first place. And of course, we know that for some students they weren't, and for our online students they weren't. So really, it's just making us having to think more explicitly about how do we communicate what the norms are within our field, what are the norms for being a student to start with, and then what are the norms within our subfields. What does it mean to be a good and appropriate group member in this context? How do we assess that, reflect on that, develop that, and how do we help students to do that in quite an explicit way? Okay, so with that all in mind, now I want to kind of change gears and start to reflect on that approach. So 5 meaningful minutes, small changes we can make that address those psychological needs. And I'm going to work through some examples. So I'm going to start with agency and autonomy. This is a really important one, actually, in terms of managing those uncertain feelings that students have during this time. With everything changing, with everything out of control, with new announcements every week on, you know, what's going to happen with assessment, what's going to happen with, you know, teaching practice next week. Universities have done a great job of trying to communicate really clearly to students around that. But of course, it's just a shifting landscape. So you can't make it really clear, except for at any one point in time, it's going to change. So agency, I think, has actually been one of the really key needs that I've seen in my students over this semester. Sometimes we have to make it really simple. So simple to-do lists. One of the things that I did with my classes early on when this hit was I just started releasing every week on Monday. I put up an announcement that says this week's to-do list is, specifying what they actually need to do as they go on and they navigate, you know, 4 different online topics that are all having things shifting around. What are the things they actually have to look on? So we're giving it a degree of controllability for them. They can work through that list. It will get done. So it sounds basic, and it is. That's part of the point. It's 5 meaningful minutes. So 5 minutes of your time, a Monday announcement, specifying what it is that needs to be done. And again, not making this too laborious or too complicated. We're not trying to spoon feed them down to the details of how they're going to do it, but big picture stuff, this, and this, life will be controllable. I often frame that within the context of getting the students, okay, yes, it feels uncontrollable, but there are some things you can control. So here's this week's to-do list. The other activity that's a really short one that you can do at the end of a teaching session. So I often do this at the end of a class. So again, the small teaching principle is try and use the first 5 minutes or the last 5 minutes of a class to do something meaningful. So I do this at the last 5 minutes of a class. I might have done a tutorial that's on some basic principle around the assignment, or maybe we've had a normal lecture, but I know that the assignment's coming up. And I'll just stop 5 minutes early and I'll say to the class, okay, we've got 5 minutes. What I want you to do is I want you to write down what your next 3 steps are for getting your assignment done. And then once they've written it down, I'll give them a minute to share it with each other. I've been using a lot of Collaborate sessions, and this works really well if you're using Zoom or Collaborate, breaking people up into groups and getting them to share with each other. Of course, what we're doing then is we're also allowing them to assess that norm of what I should be doing, that am I being an appropriate group member, is getting assessed in that small group conversation. They also might be getting some strategies that they haven't gotten from each other. So we're actually meeting multiple goals at once. Hopefully also that sense of growth as they start to track over time. Oh yeah, I've done that now this week. So next 3 steps, starting to enhance their sense of planning. An extension of this is using a problem-solving worksheet. So I've put one up in the slideshow. You can actually link to it. It's a worksheet that allows people to work through the difference between worry and problem solving. But this is something that you could explicitly give to students to enhance their planning. So it's simple problem solving, identify what the main issue is, what are the possible solutions, what are the next couple of steps you're going to take to enact it? And the idea that if that doesn't work, you come back to your brainstorm of solutions and try again. It's a self-help version of a sheet, really easy to use. We use it in our first year classes, particularly around managing stress. So we do it after we talk about managing stress. We also use it with our third year mentors. They apply it to themselves, and then we get them to use it with the first year students. So this is a way of, it's a small activity, they can take it home, they can upload it. We also use it in a self-management class that we run called the Psychology of Surviving and Thriving. In that class, the students complete it and they just upload the PDF as part of one of their planning activities. So again, this is enhancing that sense of what can I control, what am I focusing on, what can I get done, rather than worrying about everything that I can't control. I already mentioned that we kind of tie this in with our work on managing stress. I do think that managing stress it could go under multiple psychological needs, but I've put it under the sense of agency because that's where I think it starts to play out in the life of a student. So they have the physiology of stress, and I'll put a link up if you want to explore that further of something that we've done for students around the physiology of stress. But that could be feeling sick in the stomach, feeling lightheaded, tingly hands, heart rate, feeling sick, all of these things that are physiological symptoms of stress, or if that goes on for a long time, actually getting to the point of exhaustion. And a student can sit in a situation and can interpret that bodily sensation as, I don't have what it takes. So part of what we have to do in the classroom, I think, is normalizing stress occurs. This is what stress feels like. When I feel stressed, this is how I feel. So a really simple activity I get students to do is I get them to discuss, okay, what happens when you feel stressed? How does that feel? And they discuss it together. I talk about my own experience of stress and how it feels. And we'll spend 5 minutes talking about that experience and then talking about how we manage it. Because part of the problem is if students haven't had those conversations before, they're interpreting their stress as, actually, I don't have what it takes to do this. I can't do it because I feel this way. But feelings aren't facts. And so part of professional development, I think, is to learn that you can feel stressed, you can feel overwhelmed, but that just means that you've either got to go back to problem solving, get help, take time out. What are those kind of general employability type strategies that we want students to be using? So we time this, again, it's very specific times across the semester. So we usually have someone come in and do a guest talk on stress management in our first year topic. We have the example link I've put up is for our vlog series. So that's going out to all our commencing students. So again, it's about, I think we released that one last week. So that kind of times with that period of time when they're coming just back off break and they tend to get a bit overwhelmed because it feels like they haven't done all the things. So we try and time those kinds of messages to coincide with when students start to have to manage stress. I should mention that when it comes to students' express need, at Flinders, we surveyed our students as our commencing students, and stress management was the #1 identified need for self-growth, something that people said, I'll need to develop more skills around this. So tying this in, not so much to, let me say, I think that this is a really powerful message when we tie it into a professional development message, that actually stress is part of managing work life, and we need to adapt and develop strategies to develop that, because it puts it into that meaningful identity context, which is, I want to be an emerging professional, so therefore what do I need to have? Oh, this is something I need to have and develop. And of course, we want to tie that in with a growth orientated message. This is something you will get better at as you practice.
Hi Lydia, sorry to interrupt.
That's all right.
You've hit the 45-minute mark. Sorry,
Great.
I was enjoying it too much to stop you at the 40-minute mark. So
that's fine. And what I'll do is I'll just wrap up with one more example. So I've got lots of examples on the slideshow, so feel free to have a look and flip me an email if you want to know more. But the one I want to end with is this one. What does a graduate look like? So this is an activity. It's a 5-minute activity you can do, really getting students to talk about, show them diverse prototypes of what a graduate within whatever area looks like, and getting them to reflect on that. So they can reflect on that by looking at what aspects of that person or those persons that they identify with, getting them to you can take it to the learning outcome level and start to say, okay, of what this person spoke about, what aspects of this are we going to be learning about in our topic? Going to the learning outcomes, allowing them to then identify, self-assess on those learning outcomes and identify, okay, well, which one of these is your personal or professional learning goal? So actually trying to tie it in so that we're developing their sense of agency, a bit of that sense of growth, identifying a personally relevant goal, tying it into that professional identity so that they have a sense of what that looks like, and showing them those multiple prototypes so that they're not looking at graduates going, wait, they don't look anything like me. And so in their learning environment, we're trying to meet all those needs at once. All right, I'm going to stop there. And thanks very much for your time. Over to you, Darlene, for questions.
Great, thank you so much. It's fantastic, and huge amount of chats has gone on, so it's fantastic. One of your links was broken in the PowerPoint presentation, but people have actually found it in the CCI Health at WA.
Excellent. Thank you.
Found it from put in the chat, so that's great. So a couple of the questions that have come through. So with regards to identity and belonging to a group, what does this mean for students who may not have had good experience in the past? So students on the autism spectrum, for example, who may have experienced bullying from others and awkward social situations. Any advice you've got there?
That they still have the same needs, and they might even be heightened. So people who've had bullying in the past is actually a real issue. It's not even, and not just for people with special needs, but also, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm seeing an increasing number of students coming in having gone through workplace bullying, and now they're like doing a revisit of their career. And those issues can be real difficulties because it does break down our ability to connect to others without feeling threat. Right. So part of that is becoming aware ourselves about that and starting to speak openly about this, that the need isn't just around being friends, it's actually something else. And so we've been using different types of professional development networks. I think are a great way of helping people to connect. We actually have just started in psychology this year at Flinders. We've got a professional development network for students with chronic pain and chronic mental health conditions. The reason being because those people are often put in the situation where they don't have a cohort they can identify with. You know, it seems like everything they do at uni is you know, not like how everyone else is experiencing it, is how they all feel. And so we found that a really powerful way of shifting the conversation, because by making it a professional development network, not a support group, you're identifying that these people do belong within the profession, but that there might be uniquenesses to how they have to adapt in that environment. And I can see that it would be great to see those sorts of networks for people on the spectrum at universities.
That's great. So another of the diverse cohorts that we work with, a person's asked, I teach international students on a pathway program to tertiary study. I'm interested in using curriculum to support their wellbeing, and I'm very interested in what you were saying about belonging and identity. Just wondering if you know of any research happening in this space and any specific tips in supporting international students.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's certainly one that I think is there is a range of research on the need for belonging and international students. And I think I've actually put up a link in the slideshow in the references at the end to the special issue we had of student success on wellbeing in higher education, psychological wellbeing in higher ed. And there were a couple of papers specifically on international students and the need for belonging there. I think this is a huge one, but it plays out in some interesting ways, because what international students often have is a strong sense of being an international student. So they do have strong identities that are present. They often have cultural identities that are very salient to them. So those are resources they bring into the environment. The issue is, of course, helping them to develop the new levels of emerging identification. And especially I think the professional identifications are really important. That's why they're studying, is for those reasons. And so often the feedback they're getting in the environment, if it's just you don't speak English well enough, or you don't write English well enough, or read quick enough, therefore you're not going to be whatever it is you're trying to be, that's a real problem. So building in ways that we give feedback to them, not just on their written expression, but other aspects of professional identity, I think are so key.
Brilliant. Somebody else has just raised that question when you were talking about, anyway, the question is, could we sometimes be undermining wellbeing when we emphasise being independent rather than interdependent? I think, that's often some of the challenges or problems that we do.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. I often think about the competing, I think there are often competing priorities in place. So for example, making our expectations very clear. On one hand, we want to be able to do that early in the semester, right, to help people know what's expected of them. But on the other hand, if we do that in a way that then, a student who's from a diverse background goes, actually, I don't have any of those things yet. If we're not doing it in light of growth, then that can be really problematic and undermine the message. And I think it's probably the same in the messages of independence, because that is this idea that you've got to be somehow have it all within yourself. And actually it's the opposite. In order to support student success, they have to build meaningful other identities. And one of the risky things, if you get a student who's going downhill and in terms of wellbeing, and they think my grades are slipping, I've got to just focus only on my studies, and then they drop their hobbies and they drop their family time and they drop doing anything outside of uni, essentially you're kind of putting all their eggs in one basket. So now their need for social belonging, that need to be a good and appropriate group member, is only going to be enacted by their academic success. And then they end up in our office crying about their failed referencing, and we're like, why are you so anxious? Well, they're anxious because we put all their eggs in this one academic basket. So actually giving students the opportunity to diversify their need for belonging is just so important.
Brilliant. We've got a few more questions coming in. If we don't get to them, the questions will be included in all the information we provide on the National Centre with the answers. So make sure you come back and see those answers. From a wonderful colleague from Queensland, I'm particularly interested in solution-focused approaches, including solution-focused brief therapy, and the differences those bring to wellbeing frameworks, less problem-solving and more explicitly future-creating goals. How have these approaches influenced your approach, and is there any specific examples that you could give?
Yeah. One of the things, there's several parts to that question, so let me
maybe too big to answer now.
Look, I think a future focus is very important. So people have an emerging professional identity. One of the activities actually that I didn't go through, but it's on the slides, is just the idea of getting people to talk about curiosity identities. This idea of I'm thinking about, could I be a blah, right? Or do I belong with blah? And allowing students to identify specifically an identity that they're not sure about yet, but they'd like feedback on. So tying it into that kind of aspirational, what would I like to be? And then starting to think about that in light of the feedback we give. So where I've done that in a third year topic is I have a non-graded pass activity where students have to provide an example of a workplace report that they can then give to their work group members. That particular report, the the level of pass I'm looking for is quite simple. You know, as long as it's kind of competent and on topic, it's good. But what I do is I use that as an opportunity for feedback, specifically on their professional aspirational identity. So for example, I had a student this last week who is not a great academic writer, and I imagine would have had quite poor feedback over a long period of time, probably on their academic work. But I use it as an opportunity she's a great communicator to her peers. And so I focus on that, and I talk about the different kinds of things she could do in her career that would use that skill. So it's focusing on the strengths she brings, which is this ability to simplify it down and to make it, you know, understandable to the masses. And then I start to say, you know, you could try this, or have you thought about that? And we ended up actually suggesting that she write a article for one of our student newsletters, you know, again, to try and value what they bring to the environment and then how they could use that. Another good example, I had a student who has been through actually a workplace bullying situation, came in identifying some of the experiences they'd had, and then we move them towards becoming a mentor in our university. So as much using their experience to bring strength to other students, I think those sorts of practices are really useful.
Yeah, some great questions are still coming in, and I am not going to get to them all, worse luck. But just one quick one is, how often do you check in with students during this time? Have you got any suggestions for practitioners and teachers around the country?
I've been checking in weekly with students. So, well, twice weekly really, because I send an email, and I also have a collaborate session once a week. But I would say I also have very open, good relationships with my students, because the students I'm teaching at this particular point in time, I've taught before. So that in some ways has provided a safety net. I've also opened up phone calls, which I've never really done phone calls. I do face-to-face meetings or emails, right? That's kind of how I've always managed students. But I've just said to students, you know, just send me your phone number and I'll give you a call back. And that's been really good, just for those, I think, relieving some of that stress of, can I reach out to someone? I've only had a few students that have needed the call, but they really needed the call, you know. So I guess making it as easy as possible for students to contact you, rather than feeling like you have to constantly, because sometimes if you're checking in too much, it's actually doing the opposite, which is making them feel like they've got to be on top of every email coming in all the time. And, you know, so kind of it's clear, simple messages to them out, and then lots of avenue for them to approach you if needed.
Yep. Brilliant. That's fantastic, Lydia. Before I pass over back to Sarah to wrap the session up, just wanted to personally thank you. It was inspiring. I couldn't listen to the presentation wholly because looking at all the questions, but I will definitely be going back and listening because you've put some amazing things there. Just to give a quick plug, you mentioned Professor Sally Kift at the beginning of your presentation. ADSET and I presume the National Centre will also have got a link up there to a podcast that we did with Sally last week with
and
Matt
excellent.
Brett.
It's really good.
I know, and I tweeted last night saying I could listen to her all day, and she said her family disagree that, but yeah, what Sally can jam in an hour in a podcast is absolutely amazing and inspirational. So I encourage you all to listen to that. And over to you, Sarah, just to do a quick wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Darlene. Great presentation, Lydia. I was managing the chat, and when you get a chance to have a look later, you'll see huge interaction there. So thank you so much for doing that. We are making the slides available on the website. I understand there's been some difficulty downloading the PDF, but it will be up there. So just go back and check onto the National Centre website to download the PDF of the slides, and also the recording will be up there as well. There is also some details about Lydia's work, and of course, while you're on the site, why not have a look around if you're not familiar with the work that the National Centre does, and maybe even sign up for our newsletter, which comes straight into your mailbox every sort of 6 weeks. So thank you, everyone, and I just want to thank Lydia again for a highly insightful talk. I certainly learned a lot. Bye.